So it seems that Games Workshop have unleashed a digitally downloadable mini-codex for the Agents of the Imperium today. Let's take a look at what's been added, removed and changed, and how Games Workshop still seems to have messed up a bit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's new rules update. There's basically a new digitally downloadable mini-codex available for the Agents of the Imperium, so this is the Assassins rules plus the Inquisitors. They've made this a digital download that's available on Warhammer Community at the moment. I think that this is quite a good way to go for them, rather than publishing these rules in an annoying to get white dwarf, or in a really expensive rules book that is probably going to be out of date in a few months' time in 10th edition. At least from a rules distribution point of view, it's kind of a win. This update was definitely needed for the Agents of the Imperium for a whole host of different reasons. First up, they'd officially declared the Inquisition rules completely out of date and unusable in main 40k, so it's good to actually have them added back into the game. There was an issue with the Agents of the Imperium keyword. It basically wasn't in the right place, which meant that assassins were kind of not usable. And things didn't work out very well with the Arcs of Omen detachment. You weren't allowed to include individual Inquisitors and things inside that detachment rules as written, and also there was an issue with filling the Agents of the Imperium patrol detachment if you wanted some of those. And it sounds like they've fixed the first three, but the Agents of the Imperium patrol thing still looks like it's entirely unusable, which is a bit of a rules fail from Games Workshop, seeing as they've actually bothered to update this document. Overall, the general thrust of the rules is that most of the things have just been directly ported from the datasheets that they had before. There's a few minor adjustments, but the main things are changes to army construction, plus actually a whole bunch of rules have kind of been hacked out. In terms of what we get in the update, there's the core rules for the Agents of the Imperium keyword, Inquisition and Assassins. There's the Psychic Powers Telethesia discipline for the Inquisitors, and then there's datasheets and weapon profiles for the Inquisitors, Assassins, Inquisitorial Henchmen, and the Rogue Traders and Navy Breachers. Perhaps what's more conspicuous in this one though is what rules aren't included. There's no points cost, which is kind of understandable. You get those from the Munitorum Field Manual, and all of those are included there. The Assassins did go down to 90 points each in that one. Perhaps more sad though is that there's no stratagems. The Assassins had some really quite good ones, like the double kill one for the Vindicare, or the ability to extend the Calidus Reign of Confusion, and perhaps particularly the one to swap out the Assassin for another. It seems that all of those are gone, unfortunately. There's also no Warlord traits and relics here. Again, this is probably a small power cut to the army. There were a couple of Warlord traits for the Inquisitors that were quite usable, the one for an extra psychic cast and the one to farm command points both spring to mind. The relics are found kind of underwhelming, but didn't hurt. There's also no rules here for the Adeptus Arbites Exaction Squad. I guess they'll be coming later as the digital download. Kind of annoying that they're not here, to be honest, seeing as I'm sure a lot of people might want to play them in boarding actions. Overall, I'd say that the download is perhaps a bit of a mixed bag. Good to have the rules being a bit more functional, but really quite annoying that they didn't manage to fix the Agents of the Imperium Patrol. That's still broken for both Inquisition and Rogue Traders alike. And the removal of the stratagems and warlord traits and things, I think, does remove a bit of strength from the armies. Let's get into the actual rules though, and first up we have the core rules for the factions. First up we've got a Agents of Imperium keyword that's common to every datasheet in this section. This means that you're allowed to include one unit in each Imperium Patrol, Battalion, Brigade, Arcs of Omen and Boarding Patrol detachment, and if you do so, you don't break your whole army special rules, and you don't break any detachment special rules like chapter tactics. This means that you now can include, say, a random Inquisitor alongside an AdMech force and not ruin your army. The updated wording on this one is quite a big deal, as previously it was only locked to the traditional detachments, so things like the Arcs of Omen detachment were excluded, and you would have had to add them in as auxiliary supports or something. They say that you can't use it with Brood Brothers or Fallen. I guess the Fallen keyword is currently out of use in general in 40k, not saying that they might not add it back in at some stage, I guess. And also the location of the keyword has been fixed. It's now in the faction keywords bit for all units. I guess the implications of that are quite interesting. You could even include things like just a random Jokero weaponsmith in any random Imperium detachment, which is quite fun. I guess feel free to add yourself in a friendly space monkey with a little bit of firepower. Broadly speaking, this will be good news for the patrol detachment, but there's some really annoying things that mean that you can't ever legally fill it. The Rogue Traders units still can't be taken as mandatory slots within that detachment, and the Inquisition still have no legal troops. They kept Acolytes as elites, and unlike in the boarding patrol rules, there isn't any concession for making Acolytes count as troops if you take them in big numbers. Still though, fixing the Agents of the Imperium keyword means that you potentially can have a couple of these units within an Arcs of Omen army. Say you could have one Inquisitor filling out a slot in the main detachment and take some Acolytes or Henchmen or something as the auxiliary support allied with the Battle Brothers rules. Definitely a step up from the unusability that they had before. Then we've got some special rules for the Inquisition and the Assassins that are common to many datasheets. First up, they talk about the Inquisition Ordo keyword. You have to replace this with Ordo Xenos, Hereticus, Malleus, or Minoris, and this one basically chooses the type of things that they hunt and what units they're best against in-game. If you take Malleus, then the units reroll hits and wounds against Chaos and Demons. If you take Hereticus, it's Chaos and Psychers. If you take Xenos, it's anything that isn't Chaos Imperium or unaligned. And if you take Minoris, then you get to reroll hits and wounds against characters. The named Inquisitors are locked to the order that they hail from, though you can select this for the other units. It is relevant for psychic powers, but things like warlord traits and relics won't matter anymore. I guess it depends on what sort of armies you expect to see in the meta. Hereticus does seem quite general purpose though, that'll be great against all Chaos armies plus say Grey Knight Space Marines. And the Xenos one is pretty handy as well, Xenos aren't uncommon. Otherwise there's a bunch of Inquisitorial supporting rules. You can't have any more than one Inquisitor per Inquisition detachment. Infantry can embark in any Imperium transport, though other restrictions like certain unit keywords still apply. And unquestionable wisdom means that the Inquisitors get a 6-inch aura of giving their leadership to friendly Imperium units. That one can be quite nice for, say, an allied Inquisitor alongside some Guardsmen, perhaps. Finally, for the Assassins generic rules, we've got Independent Operative. Assassins can't get a Warlord trait, plus they can get a Deep Strike special rule where they set up greater than 9 inches away as before. It's interesting to note that their Execution Force special rule, where you fielded one of each of them in a Vanguard detachment, that is now completely gone. I guess in general that means that you probably can't field 4 Assassins in one army, unless you did something very weird like take Agents of the Imperium as your primary Arcs of Omen detachment, which I think would run into issues with how many units you could take in general. Moving on, let's talk through the datasheets briefly and a rough opinion on them. The vast majority of these haven't changed in any major way, but we'll go through them and talk about how the changes might have impacted them and whether or not I think they're particularly great in game at the moment. The Calidus Assassin is 90 points. She's the one that pops up really close to the enemy with her polymorphine, has a blade that ignores invul saves and is strength 4 damage 2, and gets the Neural Shredder for a chance for some mortal wounds. I feel like out of the assassins, she is perhaps the most suitable for actually just jumping on a character and killing them. Setting up very close is quite nice for that, plus they've got the Reign of Confusion special rule to potentially disrupt enemy command point generation on the turn that she pops up. I'd say really not awful value between the disruption and the command point shenanigans, not too bad for 90 points, but there's going to be some armies that she's just really not good at killing. The Calexis Assassin can give you some focus anti-psyker for 90 points, again broadly unchanged here. I think that the only thing that I did notice is that the life drain special rule seems to ignore demon saving throws. His normal attacks normally ignore any other saving throw that you have going, and I guess if his main thing is being good at smashing through unnatural barriers, it makes sense. I do find it amusing though that we've basically got yet another thing that ignores demonic invul saves, basically super invuls that ignore things that ignore normal invuls. Otherwise he has his -2 to cast aura, has the Animus Speculum that can snipe psychers a bit, and he's surprisingly hard to kill with that Ethereum, giving you a ballistic skill and weapon skill of 6+ when you target him. I feel like he's excellent if you know that you're fighting psychers, but the loss of the ability to swap out an assassin for 2 command points is quite a big deal. It means that you can't just flex into a Calexis assassin if you're playing Grey Knights or Thousand Suns or something, and that could well have been worth it for the 2 CP. Next up, we've got the Eversaw Assassin, perhaps the one who doesn't really know what an assassin does. He is just a combat blender that kills literally everything. I suppose if you kill everything, then you might well kill your target along the way. He moves a bit faster and is a bit tougher and just puts out an enormous amount of damage 1 attacks that chew through light infantry well. He charges 3d6 inches rather than 2d6, so it's actually quite reliable to get the charge out of Deep Strike Reserve. If you can jump on a valuable squad of enemy light infantry, there's a reasonable chance he might make his points back. I feel like he's particularly sad to lose access to a bunch of stratagems though. He had 2 CP for fighting twice, which was pretty big with all those attacks, plus a 1 command point for a Feel No Pain type save, which was quite good and quite valuable as well. Lastly, we've got the Vindicator Assassin, 90 points for a really big sniper shot each turn. This one's got all sorts of benefits, pretty much always hitting on a 2+, ignoring invuls, and wounding infantry characters on a 2+ as well, plus some extra mortal wounds if you get the damage through. It looks like the wording on the Spire Mask thing has been tweaked to just ignore light cover rather than changing saving throws and things, but otherwise looks fairly similar. He generally will be a threat to any infantry characters that he can see, though with 9th edition line of sight blocking ruins, often that's not the easiest thing to draw a bead on. He will be sad to lose that double kill stratagem as well. You could potentially be firing 2 shots out of him for 1 command point, which was kind of nice. The assassins in general also lost that one where they gain a command point if they kill a character for a stratagem, and again that removed one additional benefit of using them, I guess. Out of the assassins, I would rate them all as usable, but probably a bit borderline. Perhaps I'd say most interesting are Calexis's, if you know that there's going to be loads of Psychic in the meta, or potentially the Calidus to mess with enemy command points. I feel like all of them could have their role though, depending on what armies become prevalent. Still though, I wouldn't say that they're super duper strong, even at the lower cost of 90 points, particularly having lost their stratagem access. Moving on, we come to the Inquisitors, and first up we've got the Standard Inquisitor at 60 points. Again, datasheets are fairly standard here. He's a Toughness 3 character with a bunch of attacks, and can cast and deny 1 psychic power, and has access to a fair amount of war gear. I feel like this is the one where if you just want a certain psychic power on the board, plus maybe doing a psychic action or buffing leadership, then this one's the low investment one for you. I feel like the loss of the Warlord traits and relics though hits this guy harder than most, as you'd be able to pick your favourite one. Say for example the Ordo Malleus one for the extra cast, or the Xenos one to farm some command points. The Inquisitors get access to the Telethesia discipline, which does seem to be unchanged as best I can tell. Some of these are kind of bad, but a few of them are potentially useful tools that you don't get in certain armies. Terrify is usable to cancel Overwatch, which can be a big deal if you're charging with something that's fairly fragile. Mental Interrogation has the chance to rip some command points out of an enemy character, though you do have to get close. Dominator is potentially very fun if you get it off on a good target. It gives you the chance to fire with a powerful enemy gun if you get it in range. And perhaps I'd say the single most interesting one is the Ordo Malleus one, Warding Incantation. This is the one where you just get to grant a 5+ invul save to 1 Imperium infantry or biker unit. That's going to be really quite relevant on a fair few targets, to be honest. Anything that doesn't have a super high save to begin with will thank you for that. Perhaps best used on things like 3+ armoured space marines, maybe aggressors for example, though I would bear in mind that you can get that with Psychic Fortress from a librarian. Could be handy for some guard units as well, I guess theoretically something like Kazakin or Ogrin maybe, or potentially something like Arco-Flagellants of the Battle Sisters. They might be one of the single best targets, having an okay defensive profile and no normal save. Next up we've got all the named Inquisitors. For the most part, I'd say a lot of these are pretty reasonable upgrades on the standard model Inquisitor if you want the extra things that they bring to their army. Kyria Draxus hasn't really gained or lost too much from this update. I guess it's good that you can field them again. She's the one where you get a single psychic cast and the ability to make enemy units fight last when she charges in. That's potentially handy as a few armies don't really have easy access to that ability. Her smite can also opt to target the thing that isn't the closest as well, which is kind of useful, and she's got a little bit of range and melee threat of her own too. Inquisitor Cotiaz is a Ordo Malleus Inquisitor, 95 points and a reasonable defensive stat line. He actually has a bit more melee threat than most with his Strength 6 Damage 3 Thunderhammer. He gets 2 Psychic cast, and he has that nice Spy Network rule as well, where he can drain 1 additional enemy command point, and potentially intercept some enemy units coming into the board, potentially with his Cyber Eagle. He did lose that useful Warlord trait for the extra Malleus cast. I think that could have been tempting on him, though I guess it would have often been Smite plus 2 of the Inquisition powers, which might not be that exciting in practice. He's got a big leadership of 10 as well, which is particularly nice for buffing nearby units. Next up is Greyfax, 90 points, and she's kind of the focused anti-Psyker Inquisitor. She gets 1 Psychic cast, and then 2 Psychic denials with a +1 to deny the Witch. That is pretty handy against certain armies, plus a fun Psychic sniping crossbow that deals out some mortal wounds. Maybe a little bit on the expensive side, but I guess if you were going to take a standard Inquisitor for things like Psychic actions and leadership, then an extra 30 points to give it some pretty solid Deny the Witch type rules isn't too bad. Next there's Inquisitor Karamazov with his Throne of Judgment, 125 points and broadly unchanged. He basically brings a fair bit of raw might to the table with a fairly dangerous character protecting multi-melter that blasts out at 30 inches, not a particularly bad thing there. and in combat he is fairly dangerous against medium infantry, a fair few attacks at damage 2. He doesn't get any psychic abilities though, which is a bit of a downside, as often that's one of the roles for Inquisitors, to do a bit of smite and psychic actions, plus maybe that 5+ invul power. Lastly, we've got Inquisitor Eisenhorn of the Ordo Xenos. He's 85 points, and over the standard Inquisitor you get an extra psychic cast, plus some boosted war gear, a bit more defense with his Feel No Pain type save, and perhaps the most interesting thing for him is his fancy demon host, which you do have to pay reinforcement points for at 25. Malice Codiceum really is quite threatening though. It's basically boosted in every single way with extra wound, strength, toughness and attacks, and even better damage when he's close to Eisenhorn. If I were taking this guy, I would certainly take the demon host along. I feel like it's probably the biggest selling point for him. Then we've got the Inquisitorial Henchmen datasheets, and first up we've got the Jokero Weaponsmith, who I think is perhaps the most interesting of them. Technological Space Orangutan costs 20 points. He's an elite choice character and gets some actually fairly dangerous shooting for that cost, either a single anti-tank shot at strength 8 damage 3, or a scatter shot with 6 shots at strength 4 AP-1. He gets to boost his own shooting each turn as well with inconceivable customization. That either grants you reroll hits, wounds, or both each turn. For a datasheet that's actually character protected shooting that's actually quite efficient, you should be able to get multiple turns of firepower out of him if he remains safe behind your battle line. I feel like you could genuinely take one or two of these guys along in Arcs of Omen, and there'd be a little interesting boost to your army. As mentioned, the Inquisitorial Patrol detachment still unfortunately doesn't work for reasons we're just about to get onto, but I guess you could take one as an auxiliary support detachment, or one in a spare elite slot if you had one in your main one. For 20 points it really doesn't seem like the worst deal. A cheap unit to sit on objectives if needed, potentially do actions and do a little bit of firepower. Perhaps one of the biggest downsides might be that they give up extra assassinate points if you already had a fair few characters. Overall though, it does seem that Jokero might actually be usable again, even if at just 20 points they're hardly going to change the world. Next up, and perhaps the most annoying reason why the Inquisitorial Patrol doesn't work, are the Acolytes. These are remaining an elite's choice and aren't troops sadly. They fixed their rules for boarding patrols, where they gave a big squad of them the ability to become a troops choice, but that does not seem to be the case for standard 40k yet. It means that you can't field an Inquisitorial Patrol detachment, as they don't have a troops choice, and the Imperial Navy ones can't be a mandatory slot filler, as we'll get onto. It is kind of irritating. For the Acolytes, I feel like they just generally bring a lot less value to the table than the Jokero anyway. You can take them in squads of 1 to 6 and get a basic guardsman profile with 2 attacks. At base they just get las pistols and chainswords. They can take special weapons throughout the unit, though they're really quite pricey for what you get. Perhaps just the idea that you can take just literally a 10-point model with a character keyword is interesting in itself. Again, these guys could be pretty handy just for sitting around and doing actions like raising banners, or just being a single model that can screen out things like deep strike from one part of the board. Helps with board control a bit there, though they're spectacularly easy to kill. Again, could be an interesting and weird choice just to throw in as an auxiliary support or an elite's choice in an Arcs of Omen detachment if you didn't have them already filled. They're not going to contribute much in terms of damage and defense, but tiny little units like this can have a value all of their own. If they ever disrupt enemy movement or draw any serious fire for a turn, then they've probably done their points in value. Finally, we've got the Demon Host, which is a 25-point single model character in the elite's choice. These ones are 4 wounds and 3 attacks with a demon save. Get a slightly weak shooting attack and some AP3 melee, plus get a random boost to either make them faster, stronger, or give them a bit of mortal wound damage. Overall, I'd say that these guys are just a little bit random and not dangerous enough for 25 points to be honest. I probably only want to take one with reinforcement points for Eisenhorn and Malice Codiceum, otherwise I'd probably leave these guys at home. Overall, out of the Inquisition section, I feel like the majority of the named Inquisitors are kind of usable depending on what you want. Maybe Greyfax for Psychic Denial, Kotiaz for all-round utility, and the standard cheap Inquisitor are probably my favourites. I feel like Jokero are pretty interesting as well for random little nuisance units with some actually okay firepower. Definitely not going to change the world, but at 20 points they don't really have to, I guess. Lastly, we've got the Navis Imperialis units, the Navy Breachers, Rogue Trader, and the Voidsmen at Arms. These datasheets all seem to be pretty much the same as the ones they've released for download previously. Their keywords did work with Agents of the Imperium, unlike the Inquisition and the Assassin ones, but unfortunately Games Workshop haven't rectified one annoying bit that means they can't be taken as mandatory selections. The Navy Breachers and the Voidsmen at Arms can only be mandatory troops in a Navis Imperialis detachment, and unfortunately, as mentioned, you can't field a Navis Imperialis patrol detachment, as the Rogue Trader still can't actually be used to fill a mandatory HQ slot. I did think that was something that Games Workshop would fix, but it seems like they haven't done so far. In any case, for the actual units, the Navy Breachers are 4+ save, 1 wound models with a single attack. It's 110 points for 10 of them, and you get a Void Armor upgrade where you worsen enemy AP by -1 against them, sort of like old Armor of Contempt. Most of them are armed with the Navis shotguns, 2 shots at 18 inches, strength 4 and damage 1, and then they do have a bunch of fun gear that you can take throughout the units. You get to include a free las volley, which is heavy 4, strength 6 and AP -1, and a Navis heavy shotgun for 4 shots at strength 4. They also can have a demolition charge for +10 points as well. That's d6 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2 and 1 use only. You could slot them into any Imperium army, though I think realistically they're not going to be a particularly desirable choice at 110 points. Despite the Void Armor, they still aren't really all that tough for the cost, and they're a bit of a non-focused unit to be honest, with weapons and war gear that's different at doing different things, though they are really quite fun and very fluffy, nice models. In terms of actually being a strong unit, I feel like the Voidsmen at Arms are a fair bit more interesting. These are the guys that come in that Rogue Trader box set, the one that recently came out for Kill Team, and again these seem to be the same downloadable datasheet as they were before, having that same restriction that they can't be taken as mandatory troops outside of a Navis Imperialis detachment. I think these guys are more interesting for a bunch of armies, as you can field them in really quite cheap units, just 40 points for a troop's choice of 5 of them. For some armies, like say Adeptus Custodes, where you don't get a whole ton of cheap infantry units, that could be pretty helpful. A minimum investment choice to sit around on home field objectives and doing actions and the like. For the cost, they're still not really all that tough. 1 wound with a 4+ save, no void armor this time. They're mainly armed with las guns. The sergeant gets a damage 2 shotgun, and one of them gets a rotor cannon for free, very similar to the las volley in profile. 4 shots at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1, and the heavy keyword. For 40 points for some cheap grunts for an army, they don't seem too bad. Could be handy to lock down an objective or do grunt work like actions or screening, compared with investing in more expensive things like fancy Space Marines or Custodes to doing it. Finally, we've got the Cartographica Rogue Trader, and again one of the ones where Games Workshop hasn't fixed an obvious error. As we talked about, you can't field this one as a mandatory HQ choice, even if the detachment is Navis Imperialis, which means that overall we can still never field an Arks of Omen Agents of the Imperium patrol due to the other restrictions. In general, I don't think that you'd really want to add this in as an auxiliary support or an HQ choice unless you're just doing things for fun and fluff purposes. Unfortunately, the datasheet really is just quite weak for 60 points base, then extra for the other command squad type members. Mrs. Rogue Trader attacks with a bunch of attacks at strength 4, AP -2, and the other character upgrades are kind of okay for their cost but not outstanding. Overall, it just adds up to a unit that's not really particularly tough or particularly strong in combat, and though she does give out a buff to a nearby Navis Imperialis core unit, giving them +1 to hit, it's just not really going to be enough to justify her, as those units just aren't particularly outstanding on the damage dealing front in the first place. I definitely put the unit in the fun and fluffy category as opposed to anything particularly strong. So overall, I'd say that this maybe isn't the most exciting Warhammer 40k rules update that we've ever had, but I think it is one that needed to happen. To be fair to them, Games Workshop have fixed a whole bunch of basic issues that prevented these units being fielded, though it still seems that they've got further to go. For the things that they've fixed, the Inquisition are actually game legal once more. Previously, they'd been listed as an outdated rule set as per the legal supplements document, so it's good to have them back into the game for those that want to field them. They made the Agents of the Imperium keyword a faction keyword for all units. That allows all the units to be fielded as Arks of Omen auxiliary support, say if you wanted to add an assassin in that way. They've fixed the detachment rules for Arks of Omen, so you can take a single one of any of these in your Arks of Omen detachment without ruining rules. That is interesting, as previously you weren't allowed to with any of them. Kind of interesting that you've got the option to do that with things like Inquisitorial Henchmen as well, just on their own. Previously, you basically just could never take these without breaking your army-wide keywords. Now you could add things like Jokeros or Demon Hosts into the main detachment or into an auxiliary support, and you wouldn't be breaking army-wide special rules. I feel like it might have some Imperial forces looking at these a second time, even if arguably their rules didn't really get any more exciting. For the rules themselves, in general there's no real major rules updates. Really just the Collectus ignoring the demon saves was the only major one. Plus I think they actually managed to nerf the Eversource Power Sword and put it down to Strength User as well, as opposed to having it Strength +1 as it was before. I think for the most part they didn't really need a major rules refresh. The vast majority of them kind of did what they were intended. I think Games Workshop wants to keep a lot of these units as some slightly maybe choices, but nothing that's too auto-include for any army. It would be a bit weird if they just made one Inquisitor kind of overpowered and then every Imperial army started running them. Finally, perhaps the biggest losses and fails of the update are the rules that were removed. The loss of stratagems in particular are kind of sad for the assassins. They weren't exactly the most complicated things in the world, as each assassin generally just had one or two that were relevant to them. Things like the Eversaw fighting twice, the Vindicator's double shot, both of those will be kind of missed. The generic Inquisitor got a bit weaker as well, as you can't take Warlord traits and relics for them anymore. They're just gone from the update. Things like the command point farming and the extra psychic cast from Malleus, again both of those will be a nerf to the army. Finally, and most annoyingly, is that Agents of the Imperium patrol that I've been banging on about. Games Workshop really need to make two different rules changes for this. The Inquisition forces need the Acolytes to have the ability to be taken as troops, maybe similar to that boarding patrols option where if you take in a unit of 5 of them, they count as troops. And for the Navis Imperialis, they need to change the Rogue Trader datasheet. They need to change that one to say that you can take the Rogue Trader as a mandatory HQ slot if the entire detachment is Navis Imperialis. I feel like both of those changes would have the actual Agents of Imperium Patrol kind of functioning as intended, and then Adeptus Arbites could be an interesting addition to that when we get their datasheet for those. As it is though, I think a fair few of these units are kind of usable. The Voidsmen at Arms are a cheap little troops choice if you want one. The Jokero Weaponsmiths are interesting character protective firepower. The Assassins could be useful to counter certain armies, and most of the Inquisitors are somewhat usable to either provide some psychic denial or actions, and a fair few of them have their own little draws for the named characters. I'm glad to see that they're broadly working a lot better than they were before, but still Games Workshop could do with updating a few other bits. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. With this mini update, have you tempted to field any of these Inquisitorial type units in your armies, and if so, which ones and why? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all these updates and information passing, then any support keeping these videos coming on the channel is massively appreciated. Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.